This is Dennis Ramundi. I'm here with my co-host Phil Goldberg, author of American Veda. Our podcast, Spirit Matters, found at spiritmatterstalk.com. Our guest today, Dr. Roger Nelson. He was coordinator of research at the Princeton Engineering Anomalies Research Laboratory at Princeton University from 1980 to 2002, and has directed the Global Consciousness Project since its inception in 1997. Roger, thank you so very much for taking the time to come on with us today.
It's my pleasure.
Roger, this is Phil. We became fascinated with your work and wanted to have you on because of the Global Consciousness Project. Maybe you can begin with a little bit of a background. You're an experimental psychologist by training. What moved you in the direction of this project?
I was teaching in a small college in Vermont and yearned for research opportunities and discovered this Princeton Engineering Anomalies Research Project in the engineering school at Princeton. And I didn't know what they had in mind until I went there and discovered it was basically mind-machine interactions and remote perception of places and events and a variety of things that are right at the edge of anything we know, and that was intriguing. So I went there and worked with a group of very bright and interesting people for many years. Among the things that we used in the experiments was, indeed, many of the experiments was random number generators, which I can explain more if you like. But basically, that allows testing whether human consciousness can interact with the physical world, and we satisfied ourselves with high quality experiments that there was a possible interaction in the laboratory experiments, and branched out into the field and found that we could see changes in the data from these random numbers. They became less random if we went to groups of people doing rituals or went to sacred sites and beautiful concerts, anything that brought people together as a group, forming what we began to think of as a kind of group consciousness. And that's the background from which the idea of a really big group consciousness, namely global in scale, arose.
Roger,
Fascinating.
yeah, what's the most, the strongest evidence that human consciousness can interact with the physical world? Because what I've read about it, and I know there were studies done at Princeton, studies done at Duke, there was no one study that really said, all right, this is it, this cannot be disputed. Maybe there is, and I'm not aware of it, but is there one study that really stands out that is indisputable in your mind?
My first thought when you ask that kind of question is that it's the replication over many years by many laboratories and different people,
right,
of these experiments where tiny effects, which aren't convincing if you see only one experiment, but these tiny effects add up over time. And because there are many different people involved and different types of experiments, if you look at it with a kind of fair, open mind, you see a little margin that is apparently unexplainable in any ordinary sense, other than that postulated in the experiment, and that adds up over time to become a truly persuasive statistical case for such interactions.
Roger, let's back up a second, and for the sake of our listeners who haven't even looked at your website, and for the sake of Dennis and me, because I don't understand everything on your website, can you explain what the purpose of the project is and the methodology involved?
The purpose is originally to look for evidence of mass consciousness operating in a way that's parallel to what we saw in laboratory and field group consciousness experiments. In other words, looking for very small deviations from what's expected of truly random, high-quality random instruments, looking for deviations that are correlated with human intention or the presence of human consciousness. Now, what is a random number generator? It's basically, in most cases, something that you might think of as a high-speed coin flipper, a really high-speed coin flipper, thousands and thousands of ones and zeros or heads and tails per second, which can be sampled and which come from a physical source that's based on quantum mechanical principles that make the sequence utterly unpredictable. In other words, random. And given that as a kind of instrument, what we look for is changes from that expected random performance that become slightly less random. So there might be deviations from the expected normal output to be higher numbers of ones or higher numbers of zeros than chance would produce.
Can I follow up, Dennis?
Go ahead. Yeah.
So these random generators are located everywhere or throughout the world, and they're going all the time. Is that the case? And then you look at what happens when certain things occur that are anomalies. Is that correct?
Right. The generators are connected to computers which have software that collects the data and regularly sends it to an archive server in Princeton. And that archive is, so it's locked down, but we then we decide that an event is a global event, something that's so powerful and that it brings really huge numbers of people to feel the same emotions. We call that a global event, and then look at the data that corresponds to that global event, having made a very complete formal prediction involving specifying the beginning of what we're calling an event and the end of it, and what statistical analysis will do. That's a description of a formal trial, which we repeat every time there is one of these very large scale human events of interest to humans. Things like natural catastrophes or terrorist attacks or celebrations like New Year's or pilgrimage like the Kumbh Mela in India, where 20 or 30 million people go and bathe in the Ganges, and so on. All kinds of events that might be best described as something that brings people to a similar or shared emotional state.
And some of them were things like 9/11,
yes.
Princess Diana's funeral, as I recall, and probably other things we can all identify.
Right. Princess Diana's funeral was said at the time was expected to have something in the hundreds of millions, if not a couple of billion people paying attention to the funeral ceremonies going on in England.
Did any event or events take place, or at the time we were measuring anything that might have been affected by that attention on one particular event?
I'm not quite sure I understand the question.
In other words, there was a human consciousness, or much of it, hundreds of millions of people or more, were focused on Princess Diana's funeral.
Yes.
Was there any noticeable effect by that attention on the physical universe? And was that measured, or, I mean, how did that affect your research?
Yes, we had, at the time, we didn't have the full network that eventually we developed. That was a prototype, but I asked all of my colleagues and friends who do this kind of research, please run your random number generators on the day of the funeral and send me the data. So I had, I think, 12 separate lines of data, which I was able to combine by statistical means, and it did not look like a random walk, which is expected from random data. Instead, it looked very different from control data that we could generate. And the odds against chance were about 100 to 1 that this could be just a chance fluctuation. So if you were able to run the same experiment 100 times, you might see that once. So that's tolerably good evidence that something has affected the random number generators.
And so what we're saying here is that a mass kind of coherence or synchrony of consciousness throughout much of the world, or involving a good percentage of people in the world, actually can be shown to influence what we think of as a mechanical phenomenon, like random numbers. Is that correct?
Yes, it is. I mean, there's a lot of ways to put it. We have to think about such things as what is a quantum process, and it basically is a process, in the case of our random number generators, where the next item in the sequence isn't known in any, and it cannot possibly be known. In other words, the future is completely indeterminate. So all it requires is some kind of insertion of information, which isn't even energetic. Doesn't have to be, an electromagnetic field. It just needs to be some form of information that can determine whether it's going to be heads or tails next time. And that we don't know exactly how that kind of thing could happen. But going back to the group of people, the way I think of it, and this is just this is kind of a speculative model. It's not something we can put into mathematical forms, but my personal idea is that each of us, you and all of us, have a kind of consciousness field that's not constrained or confined inside the skull, that extends out into the world, and maybe even indefinitely out into the world. It's a little hard for us to conceive that because we haven't thought about that sort of thing very much. We usually think, oh, my mind is inside my head. But if you consider things like remembering your mother, in my case, my mother died some years ago, but when I start thinking about her, she becomes present in a consciousness field that I have. My mind now extends into the past and into the distance, to Nebraska, where she lived. Okay, and so back to all of us. I think basically we're all the source of an extended consciousness field. Most of the time, our consciousness fields just interpenetrate the way radio and television waves interpenetrate each other and the furniture and whatnot, until there is some kind of need or a receiver that is capable of accepting the information from those radio waves, or in the case of consciousness, in the case where there may be some kind of instrument that's susceptible to information present in our consciousness field.
Now, let me ask you on that. Are there individuals that you've encountered that have had the ability to operate or manipulate that field, or have a stronger influence on that field than others, and actually produce results that an average person couldn't produce? You hear stories of people that are telepathic or this or that. I have not seen any convincing evidence of that. Maybe you have, and I wanted to see what you thought about that.
Well, it's a very good question, and it's one that the Pear Lab sidestepped. The Princeton Engineering Anomalies Research Lab, we call it the Pear Lab most of the time. We invited ordinary people, as we called them, to come and participate in the experiments. Some of those people did unusually consistent, more, you might say, more powerful kinds of, they achieved better in the experiments than others. In other words, about 15% of the people were unusual. But I think the fair conclusion is that we're all probably capable. The difference between one person and another might not be so much a gift or an unusual quality as the ability to accept that these kinds of things are possible and get out of the way and allow them to occur. The training of yogis, as you may know, involves exactly that kind of thing. Meditation, which in the Eastern traditions is thought to, and you might even say known, to lead to the siddhis, abilities like these that we're talking about, telepathy and perception of information over distance. That kind of stuff is expected as a part of the yogic meditation training, and the guru or the teacher will typically say, you should expect this, but be sure not to let it get in your way.
Mm-hmm.
Their idea is to take that as a sign that you're making progress, not as an accomplishment.
Right. Or something to cultivate necessarily.
Right.
In these large group phenomena that you described in the Global Consciousness Project, you talked about global events shifting the results of these randomly generated number sequences. Are there differences depending on the kind of event? What I'm thinking of is something like the death of a beloved person. You mentioned Princess Diana would evoke a certain kind of emotion on a massive scale.
Right.
Something like 9/11 would produce a different kind of emotion: fear, anxiety, anger, and so forth. Something like the Kumbh Mela or the Hajj or, Christmas Eve or something would provoke something more tender and devotional and all that. Are there discernible differences in what's generated through these different kind of events?
Yeah, it's a beautiful question, and one that I've worked hard to answer to some degree. And it turns out that something like, the valence, the positive versus negative quality of the event, doesn't matter as much as we think it should. Our measures are pretty imprecise. We basically look at a period of time, maybe 6 hours or 24 hours, and the prediction we make is for a certain a deviation in one direction, the positive direction, meaning that the instruments we have spread around the world become slightly correlated with each other, even though they're thousands of miles apart in random instruments. So,
excuse me, Roger, you're breaking up a little bit. If you're moving around, it might be affecting the...
I'm sorry, yeah.
Yeah.
I will try to sit still and hold the phone.
That's
exactly
much
right.
better, yeah.
Okay, yeah. I was getting excited about all these
Good.
technical details. The short answer is that that any kind of event that produces a tremendous gathering of emotion, in other words, what I think of as a kind of global consciousness, it will produce the effect that we predict, and it won't be distinguished very sharply between positive and negative types of events. It's to me a little bit surprising, but when I look more deeply into it, I discover that something like compassion or love, compassion is the best example, is the most reliable kind of thing. If compassion is evoked or embodied in the event, it will produce a larger effect than other events.
Mm-hmm.
And that includes things like 9/11, where the effect was extremely powerful and long and drawn out over almost 3 days. But it wasn't as extreme in the intensity, you might say. It was just extremely powerful in duration over a long period. And by the way, I think it probably, in addition to the fear and anxiety, may have produced a lot of compassion.
But right, let me ask you though. Ultimately, with any research, there's some practical application. From this research that you've been involved in, do you see any practical applications, any technologies that can be developed that actually affect human life?
In terms of technologies, I would say the closest thing to that would be research instrumentation and research design that would allow us to ask the same kinds of questions, but better. And learn in order to learn more about what's really going on. And that's probably happening as we speak. But the application that I consider to be most important really doesn't have much to do with things like predicting disasters or the time to invest in the futures market or whatever, but instead gaining insight and maybe even inspiration into what we are as human beings, who we are, what our potential is, and so forth. I don't know if I mentioned I was inspired at the beginning of the project by Teilhard de Chardin's writing about the future of man, about the phenomenon of man, and his idea of a noosphere, a sheath of intelligence for the Earth. I was looking for that, for the beginning signs of something like this noosphere developing, because the Earth needs us to integrate and come together and as managers and maintainers rather than as the religions some have said the dominionists of the Earth.
So you evoked Teilhard de Chardin. I'm just repeating the name because I think your voice broke up at that time a little bit. And he had this concept of noosphere, and others, particularly in the East, have had similar conceptions of the relationship of human individual consciousness and something like a collective consciousness or even a universal consciousness. You're suggesting that your research is kind of a step toward verifying that. Is that correct?
That's my personal desire and intention from the beginning. It's not the kind of thing that a scientist is, expected is likely going to be able to accomplish as a scientific goal. But I thought that it might be possible to catch glimmerings if there's any such thing going on.
Right. Yeah. Right. Well, I want to thank you for your time. We have had some technical difficulties in the broadcast. Hopefully, we'll be able to correct those. And but any final points that you'd like to make to our listeners?
Well, I guess just that anybody who is thinking about these things should consider how important it is for us to join each other, to gather in groups of consciousness and wisdom to see what we can do about forming a noosphere.
Have you seen, one more quick question, Dennis, have you seen any research that's convincing about generating consciousness effects on the world for particular or for good purposes? Many of our listeners would know about, effects of group meditations and other kind of things that are purported to have a positive impact on the environment. Have you looked into those?
Well, yes. I mean, that's a category of event that I've examined. I guess one of my colleagues once did a collection of all events that he identified as promoting global harmony. And he found a little bit over 100 of those, and they add up very strongly to support the idea that people gathering for those kinds of purposes do change the world ever so slightly in the form of our data.
Very good.
Well, thank you very much. And you have a book. You have a book coming out soon.
Well, it's. I hope it will be within maybe 6 months.
Great.
It has a working title, Presence of Mind, but it probably will wind up being called something like the Global Consciousness Project or the Egg Project.
Okay. Well, keep us informed, and we'll update the archive to reflect the publication of your book when it comes out.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you. Very nice talking to you.
Nice talking to
Thank you, Roger.
Bye.